Here's my 2004 RX330 I just got with 145,000 miles. This car needs a little bit of work. Today we're going to be doing spark plugs, valve cover gaskets, PCV valve and hose, oil control valve filters. While the valve covers are off, I'm going to be doing a valve clearance inspection. And while the spark plugs are out, I'm going to take a peek at the cylinder walls and see what they look like after 20 years. Here I have a rear valve cover from a 2006 Highlander, and this has an updated PCV Baffle design than the 2004. So we're going to swap this part in to prevent any oil sludge issues. I also got 3 ignition coils for the rear. I'm not sure what they're going to look like after 20 years, but I'm going to swap the rears because they're so hard to get to. I'll do my best to record the process and give any tips and tricks along the way, as well as torque specs and hints from the service manual. To get the cowl off, you have to take off 3 14mm nuts that hold the wiper blades on. After those are off, there's these little clips in the cowl, 6 of them, that you kind of have to push in with a screwdriver, and then the cowl will pop up and slide out. There's also these 2 molding pieces on the edge that kind of pop into the cowl. You can just take those out of their hole. It's probably possible to do this without removing the cowl, the wiper arm assembly, but having that much more room is gonna give us a lot of space. This doesn't look that bad to take out, so I'm gonna go ahead and do it. To get the wiper motor assembly out, it's actually pretty easy. You have 1 clip right here, and then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 10mm screws. Not all of them are the same length, so I put them back in the same hole they came out of. And here's the wiper motor out. Be super careful working around your windshield so you don't accidentally crack it. We got the cowl sub-assembly out. For that, you need to take off the 3 14mm strut tower nuts on each side. Then you've got 2 10mm washers, one on this strut tower, one on the other one. Then you have 1, 2, 3, and 4 10mm screws to take off. And then it just lifts out. Be careful not to hit your windshield. One thing I forgot to mention is you have to pop this grommet out and feed this harness through that cowl sub-assembly before you pull it. I'm just gonna tuck this back here. It's out of the way. Next step's gonna be getting the whole intake off. So we'll start with the air box and the throttle body, then take off the plenum. We got the air box and intake hose off. Let's take a look at what the throttle body looks like after 145K in 20 years. I don't think this thing has ever been taken apart, let alone cleaned. So we'll make sure to get that cleaned up before we're done. I got the throttle body off. It's one wire connector. Then you got 3 hoses attached to it. Sorry, 2 hoses. You should drain coolant if you're taking the throttle body completely out like I am, because I'm gonna clean it. But you technically could leave it in the car with the hoses attached and swing it off to the side. Taking it completely out will give you a lot more room. Next, I take off this throttle body connector. It's got 4 bolts and 1 nut holding it in, and then there's a bracket on the back side right there. They're all 12 millimeters. Then there's 2 hoses that attach to it. You could leave this part on, but it'll make taking the plenum off way easier because there's 2 more brackets buried behind the plenum. So I'm gonna go ahead and take it off to make my life easier. I actually want to take this Evap assembly off. There's 1 hose here, 1 hose here, and then 2 10 millimeter nuts. Then you have 2 electrical connectors and this annoying harness holder. And we're just gonna slide this out of the way and tuck it over here. Now we can work on getting the plenum off. The craziest thing just happened. I was sitting and looking at my phone and the hood strut failed. Hood came crashing down. Luckily I wasn't leaned over. It's a good lesson to always put a hood strut stopper or an extra board, but now I currently have a golf club and a piece of wood holding the hood up in an even higher position, so I have a lot more light. Yeah, that was crazy. Okay, so we got the plenum off. To get it off, you either have to take the PCV hose off at this end or this end. Usually it just slides off when you pull the plenum out. Then the hard bolt to reach is back here. And to reach that one, I use these two 14mm wrenches. The big one to crack it loose, and then the small one to unscrew it. After that, you have 4 H8 bolts and two 12mm nuts, and then one 10mm ground. That's on this bracket. There's the ground nut right there. And here's our plenum out. There's that 14mm bolt on the back. There is supposed to be another, I think 12mm on this side, but mine did not have a bolt there. So this plenum has been off before, because I doubt they missed that from the factory, and whoever reinstalled it didn't have the patience to put that bolt back in, which I'm sure it's just fine, because the plenum's mounted here and here, so this is probably a redundant Toyota decision. But yeah, there's the plenum off. Make sure you cover your valves or your intake manifold. Looking for my flashlight. You can actually see down in the valves, which is cool. I'll get those covered. Next, we got this wire harness for the injectors and the coil packs out of the way. One annoying thing is that these two bolts that hold this wire protector on are E-Torque 6, and this one snapped on me. I don't know why they chose to use E-Torques here, but that's annoying, so I just had to crack this plastic off. It shouldn't affect anything, but I'll try to get this out when the valve cover's off. Next step is getting this injector harness out. Once you get the 3 connectors off, there's these 2 things that sit on these studs, and you kind of have to pry them up with a screwdriver or pull them out with the pliers. And we'll take this, set it to the side. Then you have to take off the 3 ignition coil connectors, and every time the black connectors, the tab will break, and the red connector will be fine. You should repin these when the connector breaks, but you can also use the zip tie trick. Now we're gonna go underneath the car and unplug the power steering pressure switch, because when we're pulling on this harness, you can actually pull that crimp out of the connector, and you do not want to have to solder a wire down in this area because there is 0 room. I'll show a picture of that from underneath. Next step is we need to get under the car and loosen these 3 brackets, because we're gonna have to tilt them back and pull this wire harness up to get this rear valve cover off. This one's a 14 millimeter. These 2 are both 12 millimeters. Here's the tools I use to do it. I had a long extension with a swivel socket 14 and a 12 millimeter wrench. I'll go under the car and take a video and show you guys where those bolts are. The 14 mil is right on my light up there. The first 12 mil is right there. And then the other one is on the side over here. I got all 6 spark plugs out. They fought me the whole way because look at the amount of rust that's built up on them. I don't think these have been changed, so they're 20 years old. The tips themselves look fine, but you should change them to avoid having this rust buildup because they were tough to get out. If you're doing this, I would not take all 6 out at once. I would do them one at a time. I took out all 6 and plugged each hole with a towel because I'm gonna do a borescope in the cylinders to see what the engine looks like. I borescoped all the cylinder walls. To get the pistons to the bottom of their stroke, you're gonna wanna turn the engine over with a 22 millimeter socket. I have a long extension to make it easier. And to get to the crank pulley, there's a panel here, 2 10 millimeter bolts. 1, 2, there may be a clip on the inside, but usually it's missing. I'm not sure if a clip even goes there from the factory. Make sure to only turn the engine clockwise or towards the front of the car so you don't mess up your timing. We got all the spark plugs in and torqued to 18 foot-pounds. When you're doing plugs and you get Toyota ones, make sure you don't get counterfeits. And if you're getting Denso plugs, make sure you don't get counterfeits as well. I'll put up a service manual for the torque spec. To get the rear valve cover off, we're gonna have to lift the harness up a bit. To do that, on the left side, there's two clips. One's right here, and the second one is right here. Once you pry those with a screwdriver, you can lift this whole harness up. There's 3 nuts that hold these wire harness holders onto the valve cover. I took those off earlier. And then down here, there's another one of these on a stud, and it's a 10mm nut. It's easier to go from under the car to grab it. I'll record that in a second. Once you have all that off, you want to use zip ties to pull this wire harness up. That way we're going to be able to lift the valve cover up and over the gears that are right here underneath it. This is definitely the most unfun part of the job. But once we have the rear done, the front's gonna be like a vacation. I'm underneath the car now. If it'll focus. Right there on my light is the nut that you have to pull off to get that wire harness holder out. I used a 10mm wrench from underneath, as it's annoying to get the socket on when you can't see it. I got the 9 bolts holding the valve cover in. They're 10mm. For reference, we can use this valve cover to see where they are. 4 in the back, 1 on the right side, and 4 in the front. To get the back ones off, it's kind of tricky. Here's all the tools I used. I got most of the back ones off from underneath the car with these 2 wrenches because it was easier to reach. The rest I got off with a 10mm socket. Next, we're gonna get the valve cover off. I got the rear valve cover off now. We can take a look inside the cylinder head. I don't see anything of concern. This actually looks pretty good. There's not much sludge at all. Here's the valve cover that came out of the car. This one even has a part number etched into it. And here's the valve cover from the 2006 Highlander. You can see the differences of the PCV baffles. This one has vents in the middle where the Highlanders got moved out to the edge. I'll feel much better putting this one back into the car to prevent any sludge issues, but it shouldn't be a problem as long as you change your oil every 5,000 miles or 6 months. So I wouldn't sweat getting this, it's just an upgrade. So I got the surface where the valve cover goes cleaned up. I use these two plastic trim tools to scrape off the old FIPG. There was some here, down the back corner, and there's some on both sides of this semicircle. One tedious part about this job is this semicircle plug in the rear, right there on my light. You want to reseal it because it has FIPG underneath it. So what you do is take a socket like this, cover the end in duct tape, and then put it against the edge of the semicircle and lightly tap it with a hammer. This will make the semicircle slide upwards, and then you can grab it and pull it off. It is not fun to clean the old FIPG all the way back here. But once you get it all cleaned out, make sure there's no oil in the surface, clean up the semicircle, then you're gonna reseal it using the Toyota seal packing. Here's the latest part number for that. Now with that in and drying, we can move on to the valve inspection. I got the valve inspection done on the rear bank. The good news is no valves are going to be adjusted. Each one was in spec except for exhaust valve here was just north of the maximum specification of 0.35 millimeters, but 0.381 did not fit. An intake valve here was just north of 0.254 millimeters, but 0.279, which was the next biggest feeler gauge I had, did not fit. I will not be adjusting them because they're right on the border. If they were tight, it'd be a different story, especially on the exhaust valve, because then we're at risk of burning it up. And up here is the specification on the intakes. They should be between 0.15 millimeters to 0.25 millimeters. On the exhaust, 0.25 millimeters to 0.35 millimeters. And what I do is I measure the 0.254, which is the closest I have first, make sure it fits in all the valves. Then I measure the 0.356 gauge, which is the closest I have to 0.35, make sure it doesn't fit. In the case where it did fit on this one exhaust valve, then I go up to the next feeler gauge, which was 0.381. That did not fit, which is good news. That means it's barely out of spec. And then on the intake, same method. To get the spark plug tube seals in, I used a 30 millimeter 12-point socket and a rubber mallet. You want to make sure that you put them in the correct way. For reference, here's what came off the car. Don't hammer them too hard, or you could rip the rubber I would recommend buying 1 or 2 extras of these because you may rip one trying to install your first one. It's kind of tricky. There's also these tabs that I bent back with the pliers. That way they don't rip the rubber as you're trying to install them. And on the one that you can see those tabs that overlap the gasket. I think they're supposed to keep the gasket in, but these stay in due to pressure anyways. So I'm not gonna bend them back. Yeah, make sure you get those like 90 degrees up, otherwise these will rip going in. We got the rear valve cover on. Couple things when installing it. This wire will get in your way, so you need to make sure the valve cover gasket is seated firmly. Once you get this valve cover over, before you put any bolts in, I got under the car and made sure the gasket didn't fall out or fold over anywhere. And then I also checked all the other 3 sides. The torque spec for the 9 bolts is 71 inch-pounds. What I did is I got these 4, or sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the front, and then this one right back here in first. I tightened them just so they wouldn't fall out. Then I got under the car, or sorry, I put the 4 other bolts in from the top of the car, but I found it easier to actually crawl underneath the car and tighten them. Here's the tools I used. I also you almost need a wrench that's this small, that's ratcheting. It will really help out. Once I got the rears in and pretty tight, I went ahead and torqued down the front 5. Then I used the torque and tried to feel it as good as I can with my hand and the wrench on these front bolts. Then I crawled back under the car and got the rear 4 bolts to about 71 inch-pounds. Make sure you tighten them down in several stages so that the valve cover gasket doesn't lift up like this or this. You want to tighten them in staggered stages and don't just tighten one all the way at first. This is definitely the worst part of the job. You also have to use seal packing or FIPG on where the, I'll put a picture of the service manual to show the locations. The coil packs are back in and the harness is secured again. Also have the injector harness in place. These bolts right here that hold the coil packs in are 71 inch-pounds. Don't forget about the 10mm nut that you get from underneath. You want to get that wire harness holder back in on the side of the engine. Then make sure these clips down here and here snap back into place. And then don't forget to plug in your power steering pressure switch that we unplugged earlier to avoid pulling the wire out of the connector when we were yanking this up to get the valve cover off. Next we put the new PCV valve in. It's a 19mm socket. And on the old one, for reference, it's about 2 threads showing. So that's how tight I put this one. I got the first VVTI oil control valve filter out. To do this, I took out the bottom part of the air box. That's 3 bolts on the bottom, and then a connector right here. I disconnected the 2 10mm bolts on the intake to make it easier to wiggle the air box out. And you also have to take, no, these connect to the upper air box, never mind. Then you have to take off a 10mm ground right here, because it blocks your way. And I took out this VVTI solenoid connector as well, because the wire was in the way. You can see it's a 14mm bolt that was here with a washer, and then the filter sits inside. For reference, this is what you're looking for. Here's a 3MZ out of a car. Here's one of them, and there's the other one on the rear bank. My filters are very clear and didn't have any sludge in them. So you could probably skip this depending on what your valve covers look like. But while we're here, they're cheap and easy to replace, so I'm gonna go ahead and do it. There's the part numbers for the washer and the actual filters. I got the second VVTI filter out. I unplugged the solenoid so I could get this hose up and out of the way, and I could sneak a 14mm socket down in there. The plastic on the second filter was super brittle, and when I grabbed it with the pliers to pull it out, it snapped, so it may not be a bad idea to replace these. Who knows if they can disintegrate over time due to heat cycles. The fat part goes in first when you're reinstalling it. Then make sure to put new washers on and clean up the bolt. I got the oil control valve filters back in, everything buttoned up, and the air box back in. The torque spec for the 2 bolts was 33 foot-pounds. What I did to get the rear bank in is there's a lot of hoses in the way, as I stuffed a piece of paper towel in my 14mm socket, then put the bolt in so it'd be held in pressure, and I was able to feed the extension through the hoses and eventually get it screwed in. It's pretty tedious, but not terrible. the front valve cover's off. There's 9 bolts holding it in, just like the rear. To get the valve covers off, you kind of have to tap them with a mallet to nudge some of that old rubber loose. Then once you hear it pop, you can pull it up. This engine looks really good again on this side. I don't see any issues. Here's what the valve cover looks like. And if we compare this to a front valve cover from a 2006 Highlander, which I have right here, you can see the PCV baffles are the same. And this valve cover went about 15,000 miles without an oil change. That's why it's so dark. It's a good reminder to change your oil every 5,000. One issue I ran into was these rubber seals are so brittle. When I pulled it off, they cracked and left little pieces, which fell into the cylinder head, so I fished them out with a pliers. So if that happens, make sure you look for all the little pieces. You don't want those ending up in your engine. Next, we'll do the valve clearance inspection. Then we'll clean the cylinder edges up and get it installed. I got the valve clearance inspection done on the front bank. I'm going to show you guys how to do that on this exhaust valve and this intake valve. So the clearance for the exhaust, you want it to be between 0.25 millimeters and 0.35 millimeters. So here's what I'm going to do. We need to make sure the cam lobes are facing up and not compressing the valve spring at all, or the bucket that then pushes on the spring. So for this one, we have a pair of this exhaust and this intake. I'm going to start out at the closest I have to 0.35 millimeters, which is this 0.356. Make sure it's clean with no debris on it. Then we're going to just try and slide this gently underneath the lobe in the bucket. It will not go in. I'm not going to force it. This one will not go in either, which is good. Once we know that, I'm going to come over here on my chart and record that 0.356 did not fit on these two. Next, I'm going to get 0.25 millimeters. If it will focus. 0.254, that's the closest I have. And that is the upper range for the intake and the lower range for exhaust. So I want this to be able to fit in both these exhaust cams. And that slides right in, which is good. Try on the other side. That one slides right in as well. That's good. Now, to do this efficiently, since it takes a second to find the right feeler gauge in the set, now we'll measure the upper range of this middle intake that has its cam lobes up. So we don't want this to fit in. And it's not going in, which is good. And then on this one, that's not going in, which is good. And we'll come over here, record that 0.254 fit on these exhaust valves, and 0.254 did not fit on the middle one. Now we just have to check the lower end of the intake, which is 0.15 millimeters, minimum clearance. So we want this to be able to fit underneath the lobe in the bucket, which it goes in smoothly, and on this side goes in smoothly, which is great news. Then after you're done recording that 0.154 fit, we're gonna grab our 22mm socket. Get it on the crank pulley. I'm gonna try to record this while doing it. We're gonna rotate this clockwise. Excuse the camera shakiness. And if we go at our engine, oh, 1 second while I rotate it a little more. All right, there we go. So next, I'd be able to measure this exhaust cam or valve and this intake valve. Then you turn the engine over a little more and do the remaining two that you did not measure. That's how you do valve clearance. I got the half moon out and resealed. We're gonna let that dry while we prep the valve cover and spark plug tube seals. I also got the whole mating surface cleaned where the valve cover gasket will sit. Now we're gonna get this old spark plug tube seals out and the old gasket off. You just pry it up with a screwdriver. Then to get these out, they're gonna be super dry and brittle. Screwdriver in between the seal and the valve cover, and then slowly pry up. Try not to damage the aluminum. There's one out. gonna blow out all the debris with some compressed air. Now you gotta get these tabs bent so they don't rip our rubber going in. Here's our new spark plug tube. The side that protrudes out goes down or into the cylinder head. So we're gonna put it in this way. And 30mm socket. Tap it in. Do not tap too hard. There we go. It's seated nicely. And now you're going to do that 2 more times. Now let's get the new valve cover gasket seated. Here's the part number for the front bank. All right, that's seated well. Now we can apply the FIPG to the mating surface on the car and put the cylinder head in. Sorry, cylinder head cover. I have the FIPG on the sides of the half moon, on the edges of this cover, and on the two sides of the circle. You're supposed to get the valve cover on in 3 minutes and tighten it after you put this FIPG on, so make sure to do that and tighten it down, and then don't drive or turn on the engine for at least 2 hours while it's drying. The valve cover is back on, the coil packs are in, and that wire harness is back in place for the injectors, Evap system, and coil packs. All 9 of the bolts, 71 inch-pounds. These 3 bolts for the coil packs, 71 inch-pounds. I put a little bit of anti-seize on this E-Torque 6 so it doesn't get seized like that one in the future. There we go. I have the plenum with a new gasket and a new PCV hose and clips ready to go in the car. The plenum's on with a new gasket. Don't forget about this metal bracket that holds the Evap. Here's the steps I do to make getting those rear 2 14mm and 12mm bolt on less painful. I leave the 3 brackets in the back of the engine loose from when we had them loose before for getting the harness up. Then I put a couple of these bolts in just to keep the plenum in place. Next, I grab the 14mm bolt and try to fish it into the hole through the bracket, get a couple threads started. Once the bolt's in and won't fall out, I went underneath and tightened the bracket. Here's how I got to it: a swivel 14 with a long extension. The torque spec is only 14 foot-pounds for the top and bottom. The top, there's no way to get a torque wrench on it, so I used a 14mm small wrench and tightened it. The torque spec for these 2 nuts and 4 hex bolts is 21 foot-pounds. Then the 12mm behind this piece is also 14 foot-pounds, as well as on the bottom side of the hanger. So I started the 12mm and it's a real pain to get in. I understand why this car was missing one. I used an extra one that I had from this 3MZ sitting here. After I got that bolt threaded, I went and tightened the bottom. Then I came and torqued all these down. Then I tried to get as close as I could to 14 foot-pounds on this 14 and this 12, as well as underneath. Make sure you get your PCV hose attached. It's not that fun to reach in there and get it over the valve, but it's not impossible. And that 12 millimeter, the trick I used is I fished the tiny 12 millimeter wrench back through here, got it on the head of the bolt. Let me get the light over. Then I reached this hand underneath and held the wrench on the head of the bolt while I tightened it with my right hand. It's definitely a pain, but once you get the technique, it's not horrible. The intake air connector assembly is back on. There's 4 bolts and 1 nut, and then there's a bracket on the back with a 12 millimeter bolt. The bracket to this piece is 14 foot-pounds. I could not find a torque spec for these, so get them snugged down nice and tight. Then make sure to get your new gasket in place before you put the throttle body on. Also, get underneath the car and tighten up this bracket to the engine block. Right there, it goes down, 12 millimeter wrench. We got the throttle body back in and the emissions control system. These 4 bolts are 8 foot-pounds. Don't over tighten these 10 millimeter nuts for the emissions control bracket. Make sure you get this ground back in. Connect up all your hoses. The throttle body connector. This coolant hose right here. Make sure this hose is plugged in, this emissions hose is in, and the hose down here is on. Everything's back together. The air hose, this PCV hose, the air box, mass airflow sensor, all these vacuum lines, and the 2 10 millimeter bolts holding on the air tank. There's also one on the back. Everything should be good to go. Now if you had your battery disconnected, plug it back in, start the car. We got the car started now. No issues, which is good. Only light on is a headlight level sensor light, which was already there. It's important to start it before you put the wiper assembly and cowl back in. In case you mess something up, you don't have to redo all that work. car's filled with coolant now. We're gonna run it for a little bit before we assemble the cowl and wiper assembly, just to make sure everything's good to go. So far it sounds good, and I don't see any issues.